Welcome to our group field class assessment in Learning Through Place, doing geography. Our research question will be based around the Black Lives Matter protests and the toppling of Edward Colston statue in 2020 in Bristol. So, our research question was, how did Black Lives Matter protests and toppling of Edward Colston statue in 2020 change the representation of Bristol's history as a city and its connections to forced labour? We chose this research question due to the fact that the Black Lives Matter protests have been so prominent on a global scale, and the protests have become an integral part of societies. We all find it interesting to compare and see the clashes between modern day movements and protests to the likes of history and certain historical events. The video of Edward Colston's statue being toppled during the Black Lives Matter protests in Bristol means we can reference it to the week 3 of the module, and this is our main area of focus. We chose to focus our research on Bristol and, in particular, Colston, and the impact the events of 2020 had on the legacy and representation of history in Bristol and the effect it had on the city.
Over the course of this module, we have been presented with a number of themes surrounding work in Bristol. The aspect of work we have chosen to focus on is forced labour. We felt this theme of work posed the most interesting questions to us in initial study, and is a thought-provoking area to look more deeply into due to issues such as modern-day slavery and heightened attention surrounding the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020. As explained on the previous slide, we have narrowed the theme of forced labour to look specifically at Bristol's role in the transatlantic slave trade and what the lasting legacy of Edward Colston has become. We have focused our research on this point, drawing inspiration from the Guardian article by David Olusoga in 2020, "The toppling of Edward Colston's statue is not an attack on history, it is history." He highlights Colston's role in the slave trade as an owner of ships and prominent slave trader, who transported around 100,000 slaves, of which around 20,000 died. We think, as a historical figure, he had a massive impact upon perception of work and Bristol's ties to forced labour, so it was a natural path to develop a question around his lasting legacy today. A non-academic source that has contributed to our choice of focusing on forced labour was the video of Colston's statue being toppled and pushed into Bristol Harbour, which we will play a brief clip of now. This viral video shows more than a statue being taken down, as it was a very important and emotionally charged moment for the Black Lives Matter movement of 2020. It demonstrates the lasting and terrible legacy of slavery and forced labour, and how this history of slave traders in Bristol has led to a racial narrative over the city, as their work influenced much of its formation. Therefore, Edward Colston was a logical figure for us to focus on and delve more deeply into the memories of forced labour in the city.
The types of data we would collect. Primary. Primary data is important in understanding people's feelings in relation to both forced labour and Edward Colston, as it enables us to witness firsthand how Bristol's history is represented and allows us to establish what people's opinions are on how Colston and forced labour is shown in the city. Secondary. Secondary data is useful, as it may have been collected nearer the time of the Black Lives Matter protest, as well as depicting the views of people we would be unable to interview, such as the mayor. Quantitative. Quantitative research involves numerical data. It can provide us with statistical evidence of the impact that the Black Lives Matter protests had, as well as depicting how particular elements of Bristol's history such as forced labour, are shown. One way to collect quantitative data is by giving questionnaires to members of the general public in Bristol. Qualitative research methods are based on opinions and experiences. This enables our research to include more perspectives and allows for answers containing significantly greater detail to be acquired when discussing the effects of the Black Lives Matter protest on how Bristol's history, particularly its ties to forced labour, are represented throughout the city. This type of data can be gathered by interviewing people and asking questions about events such as the toppling of Colston's statue. The primary research we would conduct. Interviews/questionnaires. We would pose questions to the general public, such as, do you believe that places named after Edward Colston, such as the Colston Arms pub, should be renamed? And, should Colston Day still be celebrated in Bristol? This will provide both quantitative and qualitative data, depending on what type of questions and answers are given. Photos. We would take photographs of the plinth that the Colston statue used to stand on, as well as the road signs of streets named after Edward Colston, as many of these have been vandalised by people in order to remove Colston's name. This will provide qualitative data, but can also be used to generate quantitative data by statistically analysing how many signs were vandalised.
In order to answer this question, we would also make use of a variety of sources of secondary data. These would include research materials from closer to the time, such as recordings of past interviews or other forms of media. For example, we can examine news articles from 2020 along with media coverage of the Black Lives Matter protests. Another form of secondary data we can make use of is photos from during the protests and of the areas damaged during them to provide a window into the city during this time. This study of media surrounding the matter also extends past the protests. We can make use of previous references to the issues surrounding Colston's representation in Bristol and see how people in Bristol viewed these landmarks and Bristol's history in relation to them before the Black Lives Matter demonstrations. The question. The usage of interviews with people in Bristol would allow us to gain a picture of general opinions surrounding how they view both the city's history and its ongoing connections to slavery and Edward Colston. The combination of these forms of primary research will provide us with a comprehensive view of the changes occurring in Bristol and the opinions of the local people. Our research focuses on how the representation of Bristol's history has changed over time. So, the primary advantage of using secondary data in conjunction with our own is that it allows us to create comparison between today and the time of the protest to see this change. We can utilise interviews surrounding the time of the Black Lives Matter protests, as it enables us to gain a perspective on public opinion related to the research question at multiple points in time. This means that we can contrast people's answers from 2020 compared to now. This will allow us to create a fuller picture of how the general discourse has changed over the last month since. We can also take photos of the places previously damaged in the protests and compare how they are represented now. This allows us insight both into the locals' acceptance of these Colston remnant landmarks and the city's stance on whether they will continue to maintain these sites or have considered making change to move away from what they represent.
In conclusion, in this presentation, we have shown that there are many different research methods that could be used to explore themes of work and forced labour in Bristol. Pre-COVID, primary data would have been very valuable to research questions such as this, as interviews could give a direct insight into feelings surrounding Black Lives Matter movements, and viewing the empty plinth where Colston once stood will be a significant marker of his changed legacy. However, secondary data is still relevant and necessary to the answering of this question. Interviews conducted by major news stations, newspaper reports from the summer of 2020, and maps showing historical street names and what they have been renamed to all show how Colston is no longer revered in Bristol. In the wider context of work, we have found that these changes could indicate a new perception of forced labour for the city, where its past is still acknowledged without putting the slave traders on a pedestal, both literally and metaphorically. Thank you for listening to our presentation. Our last slide includes references to the sources that have driven our research.